Welcome. I'm Seema from Edufinite. This video is requested by my nephew and I will be explaining what are clauses. I will also explain about the types of clauses. It will help you to clear your concepts on the topic. If you have any queries, you can ask me in the comment section. Let's delve into the topic. Now, what is a clause? A clause is a group of words having a subject. It can be a noun phrase also, and a verb. It can be a verb phrase also that have a relationship. That means the subject and the verb have a relationship. That is, it conveys full information about what the subject is or is doing. Noun, you know what it means? It's the naming thing. The naming word in a sentence is noun and the action word in a sentence is verb. But what is this phrase? A phrase is one or more words that form a meaningful grammatical unit within a clause. Okay? It does not convey any complete sense. And a clause can function as a sentence, but a phrase can't. So, a phrase is just a small grammatical unit inside a clause. Now, let's look into some of the sentences. Meera laughed. Now we've got just two words. One is Meera, which is the subject, it's a noun, and laughed, it is the verb. And these together are perfectly conveying a complete thought. So we are understanding the meaning. Meera laughed. Yes, there was something maybe funny or something she heard, some joke or something, so she laughed. The next one. The people in the train were talking. Now over here, the people in the train is the noun phrase. Okay, so it's a group of words forming a meaningful grammatical unit. So the people in the train, it conveys us some meaning, but it's not a complete meaning, or it does not give us the idea, a complete thought. So the people in the train were doing what? Were talking. Now were talking is again a verb phrase. So what is it expressing? They were talking. So the people in the train were talking. This expresses a complete thought, or it gives us the full meaning. So it is a clause. The next one. Do it please. Now over here, it does give us a complete meaning, but where is the subject? There is no subject. It's starting with the verb do. Actually, the subject is you. We never say you do it please, because that subject is hidden. So for that reason, since the subject is hidden, that means the subject is present but it's hidden. So there's a subject as well as a verb, and it is giving us a complete meaning, or it is giving us a complete thought. So it is a clause. The next one. He is very clever. Now over here there is subject he, there is verb is, and there are few more things beside these two words to give us a complete meaning. So this is also a clause. Now, so a clause we've understood till now that it is a group of words. It will have one subject and one verb, and it will give us a complete meaning. So that's the crux, or that's the gist of what is a clause. Now let's see types of clause. How many types of clauses are there? Now clauses mainly are of two types. Okay, so the first one is independent clause. Now first, let's understand what independent clause is. There are two clauses. One is independent clause and the other is dependent clause. But first, let's understand what is independent clause. Now an independent clause, or it is also called main clause, has a subject and a verb, because that's the criteria of a clause, and makes complete sense by itself. Okay, so just a clause which gives us a complete meaning or a complete thought by itself, by those words itself, then that is an independent clause. So what does it do? It expresses a complete thought and looks much like a regular sentence. So just as a sentence gives us a complete meaning, so also an independent clause gives us a complete meaning. It conveys us a complete meaning. Next, let's look into some of the examples to understand it much better. Sam bought a new laptop. Now here we have Sam as a subject, bought as a verb. So those two are there, and Sam bought a new laptop gives us a complete meaning. Like we understand what is being said through these words. So Sam bought a new laptop is an independent clause. Next, Sam has the old laptop, yet he bought the new one. So in this sentence, what do we see? I have underlined the independent clauses. So you'll be able to understand the things, those are underlined, the group of words that are underlined, they are all independent clauses. So it'll be easy for you to understand. And the green colored words are all subjects and the blue colored words are all verbs. So at a glance, you'll be able to understand which is a subject, which is the verb, and which is an independent clause. So over here, see, Sam has the old laptop. Now this part of the clause, what is happening, this itself gives us a meaning. Sam has the old laptop. So he has an old laptop. So that is a clause. Okay. And then we have, just leave the yet. Let's come to the other part. He bought the new one. So that also gives us a complete thought, or it expresses a complete meaning. So over here again we have the subject he and the verb bought. So this is also a clause. Now what we have here, since both of these clauses have a subject and a verb and are expressing a complete meaning, so both of these are independent clause. Now these two independent clauses are joined together by the word yet. And what is that word yet called? That is called coordinating conjunction. Okay, so we don't take into account a coordinating conjunction as a clause. That's just a coordinating conjunction that is joining the two independent clauses to form a sentence. The next one. Jane went to Agra and visited the Taj Mahal. So Jane went to Agra. Again here Jane is the subject, went is the verb, and Jane went to Agra makes a complete sense. So that's a clause. Visited the Taj Mahal. Here the subject, of course, in the second clause is she. But we haven't mentioned it, it's hidden. So she visited the Taj Mahal fits well. She is the subject, visited is a verb, and it expresses a complete meaning. So that is also an independent clause. Now it is joined again by the coordinating conjunction and. So what do we see? That two independent clauses can be joined together by a coordinating conjunction. Now, so what are coordinating conjunctions? Words like and, but, for, nor, or, so, yet, etc. are all coordinating conjunctions that join two independent clauses together to make a sentence. Well, now let's come to dependent clause. Now the second one is dependent clause. So what is a dependent clause? A dependent clause is also known as subordinate clause. Okay? Why? Because it starts with a subordinating conjunction. So it's also called a subordinate clause. Not only a subordinating conjunction, it can also start with a relative pronoun. It can also start with a relative adverb. Now, the next part is, it cannot express a complete thought by itself. So here it differs from an independent clause. It cannot express a complete meaning by itself. So what it has to do? And makes a sense as a complete sentence only when attached to an independent clause. So the dependent clause, when we attach to an independent clause, then only, and form a sentence, then only the independent clause will express its meaning to the fullest. Just by itself, it cannot express the whole meaning what we are trying to say. It's just half of the sentence. So we won't have a clear idea what the sentence will be about. But if we attach it to an independent clause, then the whole meaning gets clear and we understand what is being said. So let's look into some examples. Although he still has his old laptop. Now we see what? This clause, yes. Why is it a clause? Because he is the subject and has is the verb. So it's a clause. But over here what is happening? Although he still has his old laptop. Yes, the meaning is clear. But if someone suddenly comes and tells you, although he still has his old laptop, what will you do? You will look at his face because you're not understanding. You're thinking that something more has to come from him for you to understand it clearly. So this is what dependent clause is about. Now, next, what we do, suppose we remove the word although from it. Then what happens? He still has his old laptop. So this is giving us a complete thought, or it's expressing a complete meaning. So this then becomes an independent clause. if we remove that subordinating conjunction. Although, but we have to complete that dependent or the subordinating clause. Now let's see how do we complete. Now if we say, although he still has his old laptop, Sam bought a new one. Okay, so again we are adding an independent clause. Why is it a clause? Because Sam is the subject, bought is the verb, and Sam bought a new one gives us a complete thought, or it expresses a complete meaning. So obviously what is happening, that's the independent clause, and the dependent clause, although he still has his old laptop, is attached to it. And what do we have? We have a complete sentence which gives us the whole meaning of the sentence. Now the sentence is clear. Now, that red car with the sunroof is the car I'm looking for. Suppose I just point out, suppose a car is there, it's a red colored car with a sunroof, and without saying those words, if I just point at that car and say, the car I'm looking for, that makes sense. So that's an independent clause. But when I say that red car with the sunroof, you'll again look at me. What is she saying? She has to say something else, otherwise I cannot understand the meaning. So when I tell you again that the red car with the sunroof is the car I'm looking for, then the meaning becomes absolutely clear. So the dependent clause that's starting with that red car with a sunroof is attached to the independent clause is the car I'm looking for, and it becomes a sentence. Next, when I grow up, I want to be a teacher. So again, when I grow up. So what is happening? I is the subject, grow up is the phrasal verb. So that's the verb or the verb phrase, and that's why it's giving us some meaning, when I grow up. So it gives us some partial meaning, though not a full complete thought. So it's a dependent clause. The next one, this is the independent clause. So when I grow, the dependent or the subordinating clause being attached to the main independent clause, I want to be a teacher, this becomes a complete sentence. Now, what we have to note, we were saying subordinating conjunction, relative pronoun, and relative adverb. Now, what are these? Now, subordinating conjunctions are words like after, although, as, because, before, how, if, once, since, then, that, though, till, until, when, where, whether, why, etc. So, when we use these as the starting words for the subordinating conjunction, and it has a subject and a verb and gives us a partial meaning, then of course it is a dependent clause. Next, some of the basic relative pronouns are who, whom, whose, which, what, that, etc. So over here, that sentence, that red car, so that is the relative pronoun which this subordinating or the dependent clause has started with. Although is what? It is the subordinating conjunction that it has started with. Although he has his old laptop, Sam bought a new one. In the last sentence, when I grow up, that is a relative adverb. Some of the basic relative adverbs are where, when, why, etc. So when I grow up, that's a relative adverb that the subordinating clause is starting with. I want to be a teacher. So what have we learned? A dependent clause will not give a complete meaning. Of course, as it is a clause, it will have a subject and a verb. Another important criteria is it will begin with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun or a relative adverb. So these are the criteria of being dependent clause. Now, placement of dependent clause. Dependent clause can be placed where? Either before, inside, or after the independent clause. Now let's look how. For example, although he still has his old laptop, Sam bought a new one. So here, what are we doing? We are putting the dependent clause before the independent clause, because it starts with although, and as we've already done, he and still has his old laptop. So this is a dependent clause, and Sam bought a new one is the independent clause. So dependent clause over here is before the independent clause. Well, in the next sentence, Sam, although he still has his old laptop, bought a new one. So what have we done? We have separated the subject of the independent clause and inserted the dependent clause and then written the whole sentence. So how does it go? Sam, although he still has his old laptop, bought a new one. So whenever we do this, that is, we insert the dependent clause inside the independent clause, we have to begin and end with a comma before the dependent clause. So after Sam, since the dependent clause is beginning, we have put a comma after Sam, and after the dependent clause ends, that is, although he still has his old laptop, we put a comma and then complete the independent clause, bought a new one. Well, now the last thing is when we put it at the end. So Sam bought a new one, although he still has his old laptop. So when we put a dependent clause at the end of the independent clause, we never use a comma. But when it is before the independent clause, we use a comma. And when it is in between the independent clause, when we place it in between the independent clause, then also it begins with a comma and ends with a comma. So these are the criteria of placing or the placement of a dependent clause. Well, the next one is dependent clauses are of various types, and let's look of how many types are they. Dependent clauses are mainly of two types. So the first one is conditional clause. Now what is that? It usually begins with if or unless and describes something that is possible or probable. So if the sentence or the dependent clause begins with if or unless and tries to tell things that might possibly happen or will probably happen, then that is the conditional dependent clause. For example, if it rains heavily tomorrow, I will not go out for shopping. So that's again the condition. Like tomorrow, if it rains, then what will happen? I will not go out for shopping. So I will only go out for shopping if there is no rain. So that's the condition. If there is a condition for me to go out for shopping, only if it doesn't rain, then only I'll go. So the conditional clause over here is if it rains heavily tomorrow. That's the conditional clause. And I will not go out for shopping is the independent clause, because that makes complete sense. And if it rains heavily tomorrow, again, it has a subject and a verb, but it does not give us a complete idea. So that's the dependent clause. And that's, since it begins with if, it is conditional clause. Well, the next one. Mr. Bose will be here on time for the event unless he is held up in the traffic. So again, the sentence begins with an independent clause. Mr. Bose will be here on time for the event. So that gives us complete sense. So that's an independent clause because it has a subject as well as a verb. Next, unless he is held up in traffic. So it begins with unless. So that's conditional clause. And it has a subject as well as a verb, or rather verb phrase, and does not give us a complete meaning. So that's the conditional clause. Conditional dependent clause. That unless he is held up in the traffic. So that's the condition. So he will be here on time for the event. How? If he is not held up in the traffic. That's the condition. Unless he is held up in the traffic, what will happen? Mr. Bose will be here on time. Next, if you do well in your finals, I will buy you a gift. What is it? Again, there is a condition. When will I buy you a gift? If you do well in your exams. So if you do well in your exams is again a conditional clause. I will attend the meeting tomorrow unless I fall sick. Maybe today I'm coughing and sneezing and I'm feeling very unwell. So tomorrow there is a meeting and people are asking me whether you'll be able to attend the meeting or not. Then I answer, I will attend the meeting tomorrow unless I fall sick. So if it continues this way, fine, I'll be coming to attend the meeting. But if I fall sick, I won't be able to come. That's the meaning. So since it begins with the subordinate clause or the dependent clause, unless, that's the condition. So it's a conditional clause. Well, the next one is relative clause. Now what is that? The second type of dependent clause is a relative clause. It is usually connected to an independent clause by the words like who, whom, whose, which, where, when, that, etc. So if it's connected by these words to an independent clause, then that's the relative clause. For example, I first met Billy in Delhi, where I lived in my teens. Here, I first met Billy in Delhi. Naturally, that's independent clause because it is giving us a complete sense. Where I lived in my teens. Here, the dependent clause is beginning with where. So what is that? That's the relative clause. And it's not giving us a complete meaning, so it's a dependent clause and it begins with where, so it's a relative clause. Next, Roma wants to confide to Sally. Now this gives us a whole picture and it has a subject as well as the verb phrase. So what is it? That's the independent clause. Now, who understands her the best? What is happening here? The dependent clause is beginning with who and who is the subject and understands as the verb, and it is not giving us a complete meaning, so this is the dependent clause. And since it begins with who, so this is the relative clause. She is wearing the blue dress which she bought yesterday. So over here again, she is wearing the blue dress. That gives us a complete meaning. So that's the independent clause, which she bought yesterday. So again, this gives us some amount of meaning when we attach it to this independent clause. She is wearing the blue dress. So that's the dependent clause. And it begins with which? So it's a relative clause. Next, Meeta will take rest when she feels tired. Over here again, Meeta will take rest. Gives us complete meaning. So that's the independent clause. When she feels tired. So this is the dependent clause and it begins with when. So it's a relative clause. Next, I'm reading the book. So that again gives us a complete meaning. So that's the independent clause that I brought from the library. So again, that gives us half meaning. We are attaching it to I'm reading the book and it gives us the complete meaning of the sentence. So it begins with that. The dependent clause is beginning over here with that. So this is a relative clause. So that's all for today. Thank you for being there with me. If you have liked the content, then do give a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Do subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell icon for future updates. Bye. Take care. See you in the next one.